I never thought money could feel so worthless until I held my son for the first time and realized that all the gold in my accounts couldn't produce a single drop of what he needed most. The nurse had handed him to me with that practiced smile they reserve for new fathers, and I felt the weight of him against my chest and knew immediately that something was terribly wrong with this picture of supposed perfection. He was crying the way newborns cry when they're hungry, and I looked down at him, and then at the empty space where his mother should have been, and the silence that filled that space was louder than his cries. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and wilted flowers and defeat, and I sat in the chair beside the bed that would never hold Sarah again, and listened to the machines beeping their mechanical lullabies while my son searched for something I couldn't give him. 3 days we'd been there, and 3 days I'd watched the nurses bring bottles and formula, and seen the way his tiny mouth would reject them and turn toward my chest as if he knew instinctively that what he needed wasn't available for purchase. The irony wasn't lost on me even then in those first raw hours of grief that the man who could buy anything couldn't buy the one thing his child required to live. Sarah had died giving birth to him, and the doctors had explained it in clinical terms that I didn't want to understand about complications and blood loss, and how sometimes these things just happen, and I nodded and signed papers and made arrangements, while inside something fundamental was breaking apart like ice on a frozen lake when the temperature finally shifts. She'd planned to breastfeed, and we'd talked about it during those long evenings when she'd sit with her hands on her belly and describe how she imagined it would feel to nourish our child, and I would watch her face in the lamplight and think how lucky we were to have everything figured out. But death doesn't care about your plans, and money doesn't negotiate with biology, and I found myself at 3 in the morning walking the halls of Cedars-Sinai with my son against my shoulder while he cried himself into exhaustion, and I whispered apologies into his soft hair for all the things I couldn't fix. The night nurses would look at me with pity and offer suggestions about formula brands and feeding schedules, and I would nod gratefully while knowing that none of it addressed the real problem, which was that some hungers can't be satisfied by substitutes. I remembered how Sarah used to joke about my ability to solve everything with money, and she'd tease me when I would try to buy our way out of minor inconveniences, like when the restaurant lost our reservation, and I would slip the hostess $100 to find us a table, or when our flight was delayed, and I would upgrade us to first class to make the waiting more comfortable. "Not everything can be purchased, Daniel," she would say with that smile that made me believe maybe she was wrong, because her happiness seemed like something I could keep buying forever if I just tried hard enough. The morning after we brought him home, I sat in the nursery we'd decorated with such hope and watched him sleep in the crib that had cost more than most people's cars, and realized that all the expensive mobiles and organic cotton sheets and hand-carved wooden toys couldn't address the simple biological reality that he needed what only a mother could provide. The room was painted the softest yellow, and Sarah had insisted on real hardwood floors that we'd had specially finished with non-toxic sealers, and every detail had been researched and curated and purchased with the kind of care that money allows when you have enough of it. But now it all felt like a museum display of our naive assumptions about how parenthood would unfold. I called Dr. Martinez that morning and asked about wet nurses, and she explained patiently that while such arrangements existed, they were complicated and expensive and required careful screening and legal documentation, and would take time to arrange. And time was something my son didn't have because he was losing weight and becoming listless, and the formula wasn't working no matter how many different brands we tried. She mentioned lactation consultants and breast milk banks and donor networks, and I wrote everything down with the desperate efficiency of someone who believes information is the same thing as solutions. But that afternoon, as I sat holding him while he cried and refused another bottle, I found myself thinking about Sarah's sister, who lived in Portland and had nursed her own daughter until she was 2, but Kate was dealing with her own grief and had 3 children and a husband who traveled for work. And when I called her, she cried and said she wished she could help but couldn't leave her family. And I understood, even as something inside me wanted to scream at the unfairness of geography and timing, and the way tragedy isolates you just when you need connection most. The house felt enormous and empty in those first weeks, and I would carry him from room to room as if movement might somehow solve what stillness couldn't, and we would end up in the kitchen where Sarah used to make coffee in the mornings, and I would heat another bottle while he cried and think about how she used to hum while she cooked and how she'd said the kitchen was the heart of any home. Now it felt more like a mausoleum filled with appliances we'd never used together, and plans we'd never complete, and I would lean against the marble countertop that had seemed so important when we were renovating, and feel the cold stone against my back, and wonder if other widowers felt this same bewildering combination of grief and practical desperation. The nanny agency sent women with impressive credentials and kind faces, and they would hold him competently and warm bottles efficiently, and offer gentle suggestions about routines and schedules, but none of them could give him what he kept searching for, and I would watch their professional sympathy and feel grateful and frustrated in equal measure. Mrs. Chun had raised 7 children and spoke 3 languages and came with references from families I recognized from the social pages. But when she held my son, I could see him turning toward her chest with that heartbreaking instinct, and then pulling away when he found only cotton and disappointment. I started driving at night when he couldn't sleep, and when the walls of the house seemed to press closer with each passing hour, and we would cruise through neighborhoods I'd never explored before while he dozed fitfully in his car seat, and I thought about how different everything looked in the darkness. The streetlights would cast long shadows and make familiar intersections seem foreign, and I would find myself in parts of the city I only knew from highway signs and business meetings. And it was during one of these midnight expeditions that I first noticed how many people were still awake and moving through the world while the wealthy slept behind their security systems and climate control. There were women waiting at bus stops and men walking home from late shifts and teenagers gathered outside convenience stores. And I realized that for all my years of living in Los Angeles, I had never really seen the city that existed after the restaurants closed and the office buildings emptied, and the people who couldn't retreat to gated communities settled in for the night. My son would sleep more peacefully in the car than anywhere else, and I would drive for hours through neighborhoods where Spanish was the primary language, and where corner markets stayed open all night, and where life seemed to continue with a rhythm I had never bothered to learn. It was on one of these drives that I first saw her, though I didn't know then how she would change everything, or that the intersection of Broadway and Fifth would become a coordinates I would remember for the rest of my life. She was sitting on the steps of a closed clothing store, and she had a baby pressed against her chest. And even from inside my car, I could see the way she held the child with the kind of protective tenderness that made my throat close with recognition and longing. The streetlight illuminated them both, and for a moment they looked like a painting of Madonna and child rendered in urban shadows and fluorescent light. I drove past and then turned around and drove past again, and told myself I was just curious about what brought a woman with an infant onto the streets at 2 in the morning. But really I think I was drawn by something I couldn't name then, and can barely articulate now except to say that she possessed something I desperately needed, and had no idea how to ask for. She couldn't have been more than 25, and she wore clothes that had seen better days, but she held her baby with such complete attention that everything else seemed peripheral and unimportant. The third time I drove by, she looked up and our eyes met through the windshield, and I felt something shift inside my chest like a door opening that had been locked since Sarah died. And I pulled over and sat there with the engine running while my son slept, and this stranger watched me with wariness and what might have been curiosity. I rolled down the window, and the night air carried the smell of exhaust and jasmine, and something else I couldn't identify, and she tilted her head slightly as if trying to decide whether I represented danger or possibility. "Are you okay?" I called out, and my voice sounded strange after hours of silence, and she looked down at her baby, and then back at me, and I could see her calculating risks and options in the way people do when they've learned that safety isn't something you can take for granted. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either, and I turned off the engine and got out of the car and stood there in the yellow circle of streetlight, feeling more exposed than I had since the day Sarah died. "I'm sorry," I said. "I don't mean to bother you, but I saw you with your baby and I And then I stopped because how do you explain to a stranger that you're drowning in grief and money, and the terrible inadequacy of both without sounding either crazy or condescending or both? She was younger than I'd thought and prettier in the way of women who haven't had time to worry about their appearance, but still carry themselves with dignity. And she was looking at me with eyes that seemed too old for her face. "What do you want?" she said, and her voice was careful and tired, and held an accent that made me think of my grandmother who had cleaned houses for rich families, and who had taught me that politeness costs nothing but means everything. There was something in her tone that suggested she'd had conversations like this before, and they hadn't ended well, and I felt suddenly ashamed of my expensive car, and my assumptions about what night driving meant for people who didn't have houses to retreat to. "I don't know," I said, and it was the most honest thing I'd said to anyone in weeks. "I have a baby too and he's..." And I gestured toward the car where my son was still sleeping in his $1,000 car seat. And she followed my gaze, and something in her expression softened slightly, as if the presence of children created a common language that transcended other differences. "He's hungry," I said, "and I can't." And I stopped again because the rest of the sentence felt too enormous and too personal to speak to a stranger on a street corner. She looked at me for a long moment, and then at my car, and then down at her own baby who was sleeping peacefully against her chest. And I could see her thinking and calculating, and trying to understand what I was really asking for. "What happened to his mother?" she said finally, and the question hit me like cold water, and I felt my throat close and my eyes burn. And for a moment I couldn't speak at all. "She died," I said finally, 3 weeks ago when he was born. And saying it out loud to this stranger felt different than saying it to doctors or lawyers or funeral directors, because there was no paperwork to follow and no procedures to complete and no professional sympathy to navigate. Just the raw fact of loss hanging in the air between us while traffic lights changed, and the city continued its restless motion around our small circle of yellow light. She was quiet for so long that I began to think she would simply walk away and leave me standing there with my grief and my impossible request. But then she shifted her baby slightly and looked at me with something that might have been understanding. "What's his name?" she asked, and I realized that in all our brief exchange I had never mentioned my son's name, and the omission felt suddenly significant. "David," I said, "David Samuel." And she nodded as if the name meant something to her and repeated it softly, and I heard how it sounded in her voice with its gentle accent, and realized I had never heard anyone else say his name except for medical professionals reading from charts. "What's yours?" I asked, and she hesitated, and I could see her debating whether names were something she wanted to share with me. "Maria," she said finally, "and this is Sophia." And she looked down at her daughter with such tenderness that I felt a sharp pain in my chest at the recognition of maternal love, and everything my son was missing. "She's 6 months, she added, and I did the math quickly and realized that meant Maria had been nursing for half a year, and I felt a desperate hope rising in my throat like nausea. "I know this is going to sound crazy," I said, and my voice was shaking now with exhaustion and need and the strange intimacy of standing on a dark street corner confessing to a stranger. "But would you?" And I stopped because the request seemed impossible and presumptuous and completely outside the normal boundaries of human interaction. "He's dying," I said instead, because it was simpler and more urgent than trying to explain the complex medical and emotional landscape we'd been navigating for weeks. She looked at me sharply, and I could see alarm in her eyes, and I realized how my words must have sounded, and I rushed to clarify. "Not dying, but he won't take formula and he's losing weight and the doctors say he needs..." And I gestured helplessly because how do you ask a stranger to share the most intimate biological function possible with your child? "He needs what you have," I said finally, and my voice was barely above a whisper. The silence stretched between us, and I could hear my heart beating and somewhere in the distance a siren wailing and the soft sounds of my son stirring in his car seat. And I thought about all the conversations I'd had with lawyers and financial advisors and business associates, and realized that none of them had prepared me for this moment of asking for something that couldn't be bought or negotiated or contracted for. Something that required trust and generosity, and a kind of human connection I had never had to request before. "You want me to nurse your baby," she said, and it wasn't really a question, but I nodded anyway and felt my face burn with embarrassment and desperation. And something else that might have been shame. Not shame at the request itself, but shame at how my wealth had insulated me from the kind of human interdependence that most people navigated daily, and how I had no idea how to ask for help without trying to turn it into a transaction. "I would pay you," I said quickly. "Whatever you think is fair, I would." And she held up her hand to stop me, and I could see something change in her expression. And I realized immediately that I had said the wrong thing, and turned what might have been a moment of human connection into something that felt commercial and demeaning. "Not everything is for sale," she said, and her voice was sharp now, and I heard an echo of Sarah's words and felt something twist in my stomach at the recognition that I was doing exactly what she used to tease me about, trying to solve with money what required something entirely different and more complicated and more personal than any financial transaction could address. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean it like that, I just..." And I was floundering now in territory I had never learned to navigate because my entire adult life had been structured around the assumption that resources could solve problems and influence could open doors and money could smooth over the rough edges of human interaction. "I don't know how to ask for this," I admitted, and it felt like the truest thing I had said all night. She studied my face in the streetlight, and I could see her trying to read something there. And I wondered what she saw when she looked at me, whether it was just another rich man trying to buy his way out of inconvenience, or something more desperate and human and worthy of consideration. Her baby stirred against her chest and made small sounds, and she automatically adjusted her hold and began swaying slightly. And I watched this unconscious display of maternal competence with such longing that I felt dizzy. "Where do you live?" she asked finally, and I hesitated because my address was in the hills above Sunset Boulevard in a neighborhood where houses started at 7 figures, and where the closest most residents came to the street where we were standing was seeing it from the freeway. "Laurel Canyon," I said finally, and she nodded as if this confirmed something she already suspected about me. "That's far," she said, and I wasn't sure if she meant geographically or economically or socially. But I nodded anyway because all of those things were true, and the distance between our worlds seemed enormous and unbridgeable except for this one desperate need that had brought me to her corner of the city in the middle of the night. "Why are you here?" she asked. "Why aren't you at some fancy hospital or calling some expensive service?" And I realized that this was the question I had been avoiding asking myself for weeks, because the answer revealed something about the limitations of my world that I hadn't wanted to acknowledge. "Because they don't work like this," I said. "The services and the consultants and the specialists, they all want paperwork and background checks and legal agreements and medical histories, and my son doesn't have time for any of that." And even as I said it, I could hear how privileged and impatient I sounded, but it was also true that bureaucracy moved at a different pace than desperate need. "And you think I'm different," she said, and there was something challenging in her voice now. "You think because I'm here on the street I don't have standards or boundaries or reasons to be careful about strangers who pull up in expensive cars and ask for impossible things." She was right, and I felt the weight of my assumptions settling over me like a heavy coat. And I realized that everything about this encounter was wrong from my perspective, and probably insulting from hers, and I should get back in my car and drive home, and figure out some other solution that didn't involve approaching strangers in the middle of the night. But my son chose that moment to wake up and begin crying, and the sound cut through the night air like a blade. And I saw Maria's face change as her body responded instinctively to the sound of an infant in distress. "Bring him here," she said, and her voice was different now, gentler but also more commanding, and I felt a surge of hope so intense it made my hands shake as I opened the car door and lifted David from his seat and carried him to where she was sitting on the store steps. He was crying harder now, the way he did when he was truly hungry and not just fussy, and I could see Maria watching his face and listening to the particular quality of his distress with the expertise of someone who understood infant needs at a cellular level. "How long since he ate?" she asked, and I tried to remember the last bottle, and realized it had been hours because he had refused it like he refused all of them. and I had eventually given up and decided to drive until he fell asleep. This morning, I said he won't take the bottles anymore, he just. And I made a helpless gesture because there were no words for the way he would turn his head away and cry as if the formula itself was causing him pain. She looked at David and then at her own sleeping daughter. And I could see her weighing something internal and complex, and I held my breath, because I realized that this moment would determine whether my son continued to fail to thrive, or whether some stranger's kindness might save his life. The streetlight made harsh shadows on all our faces and turned the moment into something biblical and desperate, and entirely outside my experience of how problems got solved. "Sit down," she said finally and gestured to the step beside her. And I sat carefully, because I didn't want to disturb whatever fragile possibility was forming between us. And she shifted Sophia to one arm, and held out her other hand toward David. And I passed him to her with the same care I might use handling something made of spun glass. He continued crying, but she held him close to her chest, and began making soft shushing sounds and rocking slightly. And I watched her face as she studied his and realized that she was reading signals and cues that I had never learned to interpret. "He's beautiful," she said softly, and something in her voice made my throat close, and I nodded because he was beautiful in the way all babies are beautiful, but also in the specific way that carried traces of Sarah's delicate features and my own stubborn chin. "Can you help him?" I asked, and my voice cracked on the words because this was the moment of truth. And I realized that everything that had happened since Sarah died had been leading to this question asked of this woman on this street corner in the middle of a night that had started like every other night of driving and hoping and failing to find solutions that money could buy. She looked at me for a long moment, and then down at David, who was still crying, but with less desperation now, as if something about her presence was already calming him, and she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "I can help him." And those 4 words contained more hope and relief than I had felt since the moment the doctor told me Sarah was gone. And I realized that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places, and in forms you never thought to pray for. What happened next changed everything, though I wouldn't understand the full weight of that change until much later, when the immediate crisis had passed, and I could see clearly what had been set in motion on that corner under the yellow streetlight. Maria lifted her shirt with the unself-conscious grace of someone for whom nursing was as natural as breathing, and David latched immediately with a desperation that made my chest tight with gratitude and grief in equal measure, because watching him finally get what he needed reminded me of everything Sarah would never see and everything I would never be able to give him myself. I sat there on the concrete steps of a closed store at 3 in the morning watching a stranger feed my son, and felt something fundamental shift inside me, like tectonic plates settling into new positions after an earthquake. The sound he made as he nursed was soft and satisfied, and completely different from the frustrated crying that had become the soundtrack to our days. And I realized that I was witnessing the first moment since his birth when he was truly content and peaceful, and receiving exactly what his body needed to survive. Maria looked down at him with such tenderness that I had to look away, because it reminded me too sharply of how Sarah used to look at him when he was still inside her, and she would talk to him through her skin and promise him all the things she would never live to deliver. "He's very hungry," Maria said quietly, and there was no judgment in her voice, just simple observation. And I nodded because he was hungry in ways that went beyond the physical hunger that formula couldn't satisfy. "Thank you," I said, and the words felt completely inadequate for what was happening. But they were all I had, and she looked at me with something that might have been understanding or might have been pity, and I didn't care which, because my son was finally eating, and everything else seemed secondary to that fundamental victory. "I don't know how to repay you," I added, and she shook her head slightly as if the concept of repayment didn't apply to what we were doing. "Some things you don't repay," she said, "some things you just accept and try to deserve." And I felt the weight of that statement settle over me, because I realized that what she was offering couldn't be earned through any system of exchange I understood, and required instead a kind of grace that I had no experience receiving. Sophia stirred in her sleep against Maria's other arm, and I saw how naturally she managed both children, and wondered what circumstances had brought her to the streets with an infant. and whether my son's need was taking anything away from her daughter's security. "Where are you staying?" I asked carefully because the question seemed important but also intrusive, and she hesitated before answering as if weighing how much truth to share with me. "Different places," she said finally. "We move around." And I understood that this was a careful way of saying they were homeless. And I felt something twist in my stomach at the recognition that the woman saving my son's life didn't have a safe place to sleep at night. "You could stay with us," I said impulsively. "I have plenty of room and David clearly needs." And she was already shaking her head before I finished the sentence, and I could see walls going up behind her eyes at the suggestion. "That's not how this works," she said, and her voice was firm now. "I can help your baby, but that doesn't mean we're moving into your world just because you have space and money and guilt about how different our lives are." She was right, and I felt the sting of recognition that I was once again trying to solve something complex with the simple application of resources and good intentions, and missing the deeper currents of what was actually happening between us. "I'm sorry," I said. "I didn't mean to assume anything, I just thought." And I stopped because what I had thought was exactly what she was calling out. And there was no way to explain it that didn't sound condescending or naive. "You thought you could fix everything," she said, "and it wasn't cruel, just matter of fact." And I nodded, because that was exactly what I had thought, and what I always thought when faced with problems that seemed solvable through the application of sufficient resources. "Some things can't be fixed," she continued. "They can only be lived through and survived, and sometimes if you're very lucky, someone comes along who can help you survive them." David had fallen asleep while nursing, and his face was slack with satisfaction and peace, and I watched his tiny chest rise and fall with the steady rhythm of deep sleep, and felt more grateful than I had ever felt for anything in my life, including all the business successes and financial milestones that had once seemed so important. "He looks different," I said, and it was true because the constant tension of hunger had left his features, and he looked like what he was supposed to be, which was a healthy newborn instead of a failing one. "He just needed what he needed," Maria said simply, and she adjusted her shirt and settled both babies more comfortably against her chest. And I realized that she was preparing to leave, and that this moment of grace was coming to an end, and I would have to figure out how to maintain what had just been established between us. "Will you be here tomorrow night?" I asked, and immediately felt stupid for the assumption that she had routines or schedules or any kind of predictable existence. "I don't know," she said, "maybe." And then she looked at me with something that might have been curiosity or concern and asked, "What will you do if I'm not?" And I realized that I didn't have an answer, because in the space of an hour she had become essential to my son's survival, and I had no backup plan that didn't involve continuing to watch him fail to thrive on formula that his body rejected. "I don't know either," I said, and it felt like the most honest exchange we'd had, because neither of us knew what came next or how to navigate the strange territory we'd entered when desperation and compassion intersected on a street corner in downtown Los Angeles. "Maybe we could figure it out together," I added, and she was quiet for so long that I thought she wasn't going to respond at all. "Maybe," she said finally, and stood up carefully with both babies, and I stood too and felt the awkwardness of not knowing how to end this encounter that had been unlike anything in my experience. "I'll be driving around tomorrow night," I said, "if you need anything, or if," and I gestured vaguely because what I meant was if you're willing to save my son's life again. But that seemed like too much to ask directly. She nodded and began walking away, and then turned back and said, "What's your name?" And I realized that in all our conversation, I had never introduced myself, and she had agreed to help my child without knowing anything about me except that I was desperate and driving an expensive car in the middle of the night. "Daniel," I said, "Daniel Morrison." And she repeated it the same way she had repeated David's name earlier, with that slight accent that made it sound different and somehow more significant. "Daniel," she said, "bring him back tomorrow if he needs me." And then she was walking away into the darkness with her daughter sleeping against her shoulder, and I stood there watching until they disappeared around the corner, and then got back in my car with my son, who was sleeping more peacefully than he had since we'd brought him home from the hospital. The drive back to Laurel Canyon felt different, with David calm in his car seat, and the crisis temporarily resolved, And I found myself thinking about Maria and wondering what her story was and how she had ended up caring for an infant on the streets, and whether what had just happened between us was a one-time act of kindness or the beginning of something more complicated and necessary. The hills looked different too as I wound my way up toward home, and I realized that something about the night had changed my relationship to the city and to the life I had built there. When I carried David into the house, it felt enormous and empty the way it always did. But there was something different now in the emptiness, because it contained the possibility of change and the recognition that the solution to our problem might not come from within the safe boundaries of my familiar world. I put him in his crib and he continued sleeping with the deep satisfaction of a child who had finally received what he needed most. And I sat in the chair beside him and watched him breathe and thought about Maria and wondered if she was safe wherever she was spending the night. I called Dr. Martinez the next morning and told her that David had nursed successfully, and she was surprised and pleased and asked where I had found a wet nurse, and I hesitated because how do you explain to a Beverly Hills pediatrician that you had approached a homeless woman on a street corner in downtown LA and asked her to feed your child? Through a friend, I said finally, and she made notes and asked if this was going to be a regular arrangement. And I said I hoped so and realized that I was already planning to drive back to that corner and pray that Maria would be there. What I didn't tell Dr. Martinez was that something had shifted in me during those hours on the street corner, and that for the first time since Sarah died I had felt connected to something larger than my own grief and isolation. Watching Maria care for my son with such natural competence had reminded me that parenthood was supposed to be about connection and community, and the sharing of responsibilities that were too large for any one person to carry alone. My wealth had insulated me from that kind of interdependence, but it had also deprived me of the support systems that most people took for granted. That night I drove back to Broadway and Fifth with David in his car seat, and a strange mixture of hope and anxiety in my chest, because I had no guarantee that Maria would be there, or that she would be willing to help again. And I realized that my son's survival had become dependent on the kindness of a stranger whose own circumstances were precarious and uncertain. But when I turned the corner, I saw her sitting on the same steps with Sophia in her arms, and she looked up as my headlights swept across the storefront and smiled slightly, as if she had known I would come back. What happened over the following weeks as this arrangement continued and deepened and became something neither of us had expected was that Maria became not just David's source of nourishment, but mine as well, though I wouldn't recognize that until much later when she was gone and I was left trying to understand what she had given me beyond the simple biological function that had saved my son's life. She taught me things about parenthood and resilience and the difference between surviving and living that I had never learned in all my years of education and success and accumulation of resources. She also taught me something about myself that I had never wanted to acknowledge, which was that my wealth had made me soft and dependent and unprepared for the kinds of challenges that required more than money to solve, and that there was a strength in people like her who had learned to navigate impossible circumstances with grace and dignity, and a kind of wisdom that couldn't be purchased or inherited or earned through any system I understood. But that first night when she fed David again, and he fell asleep satisfied and peaceful in her arms, and she handed him back to me with the same careful tenderness she showed her own daughter, I only knew that we had been saved, and that salvation had come in a form I never could have imagined, and from a source I never would have thought to seek, and that sometimes the most important gifts come disguised as encounters with strangers who turn out to be exactly who you needed them to be.